All right, welcome to my talk on celebrating your mistakes. My name is Joe Glombek. I am a .NET web developer at Bump Digital in the UK, and I'm also an Umbraco MVP. You can catch me online on my website and blog, joe.gl, and also I'm on Twitter, dev and code newbie as @Joe Glombek. So we're going to be talking about celebrating your mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. We've heard it time and again, but there's always that nagging voice inside our heads telling us to hide it away somewhere and pretend it never happened. So why do we do that? Well, first of all, it's embarrassing. I can do better than that kind of attitude. It can also play into imposter syndrome. So if we don't feel like we deserve the job or the career path we've chosen, if we don't feel like we don't deserve it, our mistakes might indicate to ourselves that actually maybe that imposter syndrome was right. Of course it's not. We all make mistakes, but that can be one of the reasons why we don't. But it's human nature. We'd rather talk about our successes than our failures. In this article from the BBC, the human inclination is to put our heads in the sand once we've embarked on our path. If we've gone off track, we grit our teeth, continue and hope for the best. It's just human nature to make a decision and run with it, whether it's the best one or not. But what's the cost then of hiding our mistakes? We know why we do them, but why is it a bad thing? We're going to take a look at the case of the wrongful conviction of Adam Brazil. Now, content warning, we are going to do a brief discussion of a murder case. Very brief, but do skip ahead 90 seconds if you need to. So Malcolm Burrows was murdered outside his home in Tennessee. There were some witnesses, his family. They described a man with red hair who drove away in a gold car. Now, there aren't that many red-haired people in the town that this happened. So the first question the police sergeant asked was, does anybody know anybody with red hair? Bit of digging, and eventually somebody suggested that they knew someone with red hair. Adam Brazil had red hair, and when they went to see Adam, turns out he'd been away from home driving his mum's gold car, as described, at the time of the murder. Now, with no physical evidence whatsoever, only the witness's identification of Adam, he was convicted and jailed for life. There's more information, by the way, on this story on the Criminal Podcast, episode 133. If you want more detail on this story and take away any other learnings from it, it's really, really interesting. Now, the mistakes that were made here. There were actually two Sergeant Browns. So one Sergeant Brown found the body and dealt with the immediate aftermath of the crime, while a different Sergeant Brown was tasked with watching the house after the event had happened. Now, the latter spoke at the trial, whereas the former didn't. So the sergeant who found the body thought it was odd at the time that he wasn't called up to speak at the trial, but I guess these things happen. He was told he wasn't needed. But there was, during the trial, ambiguity over whether or not the body had a wallet on him or not. So it was implied that Adam could have been stealing from Malcolm Burrows, and that's why the events happened. However, the original Sergeant Brown, the Sergeant Brown that found the body, could have confirmed that there was still the wallet on the body, despite what was said at trial, if he'd been at trial, which he wasn't. There were also numerous issues with a photo lineup to identify a criminal. The family were given a list of 8 photographs of men, but not all of them had red hair. We'd already established by this point that they were looking for someone with red hair. And there may have been a little bit of suggestion dripped in as well. There were also missing records, and the fingerprints recovered from the scene didn't match Adam. They weren't matched to anyone else at the time, but they didn't match Adam. Now, obviously, now Adam is released from jail. He's a free man. So what was the remedy to this situation? So the Sergeant Brown who found the body came forward with his knowledge and made himself available to Adam's legal team at the time. And that fingerprint was eventually matched to someone called Kermit Bryson. Now, Kermit Bryson was connected to the victim, unlike Adam, had a history of crime, unlike Adam, had red hair, much like Adam, and his girlfriend at the time had a gold car. In fact, he confessed as well to this crime to a friend. Now, this was by no means an ideal outcome, but Adam was released from prison, like I said, and lessons were learnt from these mistakes. So Judge Angel and others involved in the case are now looking out for other similar situations. So this is a quote here from Judge Angel. "There are mistakes that are made, and I want to do everything I can to keep these types of mistakes from ever happening again anywhere, especially in my district and in the state of Tennessee." So he's looking out for these things. There are lessons that have been learned from the mistakes made in this case, and he knows what to look for in other cases. There's also people listening to the criminal podcast, like I mentioned, and other media that covered the story, and people who have listened and read and consumed that information will have learned from that as well. There's also things like the photo lineup, how this case plays into how inaccurate a photo lineup can be for identifying people. So let's take a different view. Let's have a look at TDODAR, which is a decision-making model used in the airline industry. So if an emergency occurs, they use the TDODAR, very hard to say, a decision-making model to help find a solution to the problem. So first of all, what does it stand for? Time. How much time do we have? How much time do we have to solve this issue? How much time before it escalates? Diagnosis. What is the problem? Quite simple, but it's important to not skip this step. Then we go to options, and that's to list all the possible solutions to this problem. Whether you think they're the best or not, we're just going to list every option we've got. And then the person who's in charge takes charge, picks one of those options, and makes a decision to do that option. They then assign the tasks to relevant people and review. As soon as there's time for a review, one is conducted. The review process asks one main question: did we make any mistakes? So a lapse in judgment while flying is a matter of life or death. So it's fully accepted that mistakes should be identified early and often so that they can be rectified as soon as possible. If it's good for pilots, it's probably good for all of us. There's also a talk by Clifford Agius. He's a pilot and a developer, and he does a talk on TDODAR, the pilot critical decision-making skills, and how that can relate to development. Very interesting talk. So honesty is the best policy, right? What impact would admitting mistakes have had in that case we talked about of Adam, or in an emergency in the air? Things can be rectified a lot sooner than they were perhaps in Adam's case. Things could have been rectified much, much earlier. He might not have gone to prison in the first place. He might have been able to get out of prison earlier. And who would have been at fault if those mistakes had been highlighted earlier? Well, actually, probably no one. If a mistake's identified early enough, it's nobody's fault, right? So it doesn't become a problem. Even if someone is at a little bit of fault, it's not as serious as putting someone in prison wrongfully. So it's definitely the best option we've got. And how does this apply to development then? Well, all of us make mistakes. Everyone watching this talk, everyone you work with, will be making mistakes on a regular basis. If you're not seeing them, maybe it's time to start talking about them. We need to create a culture of sharing. So learning from others' mistakes is one part of this, and that can remind us that everyone makes mistakes. It can make us feel better about ourselves. It can help alleviate that imposter syndrome that a lot of us in this career experience. But it also saves us from making the same mistakes as that other developer. So we're learning from other people without having to make that mistake ourselves and learning from that. So it's really useful. But also we can share our own mistakes, and that has some benefits for us and the team as well. It saves our team making the same mistake, or not necessarily our team, but peers if we're sharing with people that we don't work with. And it also reinforces that learning experience that we've had from making that mistake. So it helps us to remember the mistakes we've made and learn from them and move on. So we don't really understand how valuable our failures can be, not instinctively at least. So I've got an example of a study where volunteers were asked 2 sets of questions with 2 possible answers. So lots of questions, all multiple choice, but they were split into 2 parts. Then the researchers told them the first set, they'd got absolutely every question wrong. 50-50 chance, they got all of them wrong. And they didn't have time to mark the second set. Then the volunteers were asked if they wanted to share the results that they'd received with another candidate to help them with the test. And 70% of them opted to share the unmarked set rather than the marked set where they got it 100% wrong. Now, if we think through this, the marked set that's 100% wrong is highly valuable because they've got every question wrong and there's only 2 options for each question. We now know we have that source of data for what 100% of the right answers are. But instinctively, these volunteers didn't want to share where they'd messed up and instead chose to share where they didn't know whether they'd messed up. They were just sharing their best guess at the questions. Now, good sign though, when researchers pointed out the wrong answers were the more valuable of the 2, the volunteers were much more willing to share that data, the incorrect data. So maybe this talk can be your indication that mistakes are valuable and that we need to share them too. It's not just in this very contrived example, but it applies to our day-to-day lives. Day-to-day? But when? When do we do these things? When is a good time to share our mistakes? Well, project or sprint wash-ups or retrospectives, that's time specifically designed for discussing what went well and what didn't go so well in a project. Now, some of those things that didn't go so well, there are mistakes. This is a fantastic time to talk about them. It's exactly what it's designed for. You might also have an opportunity to do a one-to-one with a boss or a mentor, talking about your progress. And remember, mistakes are progress as well. If you take a mistake and you learn from that mistake, that's a huge leap in progress. So it's definitely something you want to be talking about at your one-to-ones. If you've made a mistake and haven't maybe thought about what the learnings are from it, it's another great time to bring it up and discuss with your boss, your mentor, what you could learn from those mistakes. Another way you can share your mistakes is through your commit history. If you're using source control, using Git, you can use your commit history as a way to highlight your mistakes. Now, some people really like to hide their mistakes and they will do that by overwriting their Git history. I'm very opposed to this because so much can be learnt and documented just in that Git history. I've done a whole talk on what I think Git best practices are, and you can find that on my website, joe.gl. There's a talk there as well, talk recording and a blog post. So just don't overwrite your history. You can use that yourself to see why you'd made decisions in certain ways in the past, how you've made a mistake, how you've rectified the mistake. And you can share that with your team as well if you're working in a team. Coding in public is another fantastic way to share mistakes. So if you've got any code that you've written yourself, if open sourcing it is an option, that's an absolutely fantastic way to get opinions from other people. People are going to raise bugs, raise issues on your project, and you can then learn that you've made a mistake and someone might help you to rectify it, or you might be able to rectify it yourself. If you don't have any open source project yourself, you can collaborate and go and do some work for a different open source project. There are issues there which you can go and see bugs that other developers have written. You found their mistakes and rectify them. So you can learn from others' mistakes when you're contributing to an open source project. And you'll also get feedback from the people who own that repository. If you try to commit to the repository, they'll be able to give you some feedback and you can learn from that as well. That's a really fantastic way, especially if you're not working in a team. This one works really well, not in a team. And you want to be doing that as much as possible. And whether that's sharing blog posts, discussing in community groups, on your solo projects, or if you're at the office and you're having a cup of coffee, discuss your mistakes then. It's really, really valuable. I hope I've managed to get that across, how valuable mistakes can be, what we can learn from them, and how that we can make us, our team members, and our peers grow as a result of those mistakes. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you around.